my brakes. Ready to get started. Start at the top. I'm going to check to make sure there's no tree limbs or electrical wires, anything that my vehicle might hit as I go to pull away. Also checking my lenses on the top of my cab to make sure none are broken or missing. I want to check my windshield to make sure I don't have any cracks 2 inches long or 2 intersecting cracks. Checking the front of my vehicle for any damage to my vehicle. Checking to make sure I have a current tag up to date. I'll look underneath the vehicle. I'm looking for leaks of any kind, any coolant, oil, transmission fluid, leaks of any kind. Open the hood. Grab that latch over there. Came back and get caught up. Okay. All right, I'm going to start up here. I'm going to check my windshield wiper arm tension to make sure I've got good tension on my arm. I'm going to check my windshield wiper blade to make sure it's not worn too thin or frayed. Coming across, I'm checking my hoses to make sure there's no cut or tape on any of my hoses. I'm going to check my clamps to make sure none of my clamps are missing or broken. I'm going to check my alternator to make sure it's securely mounted. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Make sure that the electrical connections, the red line and the white line, are secured to the back of my alternator. I've got a serpentine belt. I want to make sure there's no play on a serpentine belt. It's not cut or frayed or worn. If I had a V-belt, I wouldn't have any more than 3/4 to 1 inch of play. I'm going to check my water pump. It's located inside the front of the motor. If it were leaking, I'd see coolant coming down the front of the engine. I'm going to check my fan blade to make sure it's securely mounted and it doesn't hit my shroud. I'm looking for anything else on this side of the vehicle that might be missing or broken. And we'll start high again. We'll come across and we'll check my coolant level to make sure I have plenty of coolant. Check my hoses to make sure none of my hoses are cut or taped. None of my clamps are missing or broken. Checking hoses for cut or tape and they're secure. Checking up here electrical lines, air lines, make sure there's no cut, tape on any of my lines. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Come down, I would check my oil, take it out, wipe it, make sure I have plenty of oil. Put my oil stick back in. Tell her I would check my transmission fluid. I'm going to check my air compressor to make sure my air compressor is securely mounted. It's not loose, it's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. The copper tubing coming off of my air compressor is secure, it's not crimped, it's not broken. I would check my power steering fluid to make sure I have plenty of power steering fluid. I would check to make sure I have plenty of washer fluid, windshield washer fluid. Come across, I'm checking hoses again, make sure there's no cut or tape on any hoses. Clamps are all secure. Check my steering shaft to make sure it's not too loose, bent, warped, and make sure there's no debris in this little U-joint area. It's not missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I'm going to check my steering gearbox to make sure it's securely mounted, not missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Checking my power steering hoses to make sure there's no cut or tape on my power steering hoses and the clamps are secure. I'm going to check my frame to make sure there's no cracks or wells. I'm going to check my pitman arm to make sure it's securely mounted. It's not loose. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I'm going to check my spring hanger, spring mount, make sure it's not cracked or welded. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I'm going to check my drag link to make sure it's not loose. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I'm going to check my leaf springs to make sure there's none missing or broken. I'm going to check my spring U-bolt spring mounts to make sure they're not missing any nuts and they're secure, and then my leaf spring is mounted correctly to my axle. We'll check my shock absorber to make sure it's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins, and it's not leaking any grease. We'll check my tie rod to make sure it's not bent, broken, it's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Then we'll check my air hose. Make sure that there's no cut or tape and it's secure to the brake chamber. I'm going to check the brake chamber to make sure it's securely mounted. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. And I don't hear any air leaks. I'm going to check my slack adjuster Make sure it's mounted at a 90-degree angle. Make sure it's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. And make sure when I pull the slack adjuster, the push rod doesn't move any more than 3/4 to 1 inch, and my push rod's not bent, broken, or missing. I'm going to come down and I'm going to check my brake shoes to make sure none of my brake shoes are worn too thin, missing, or broken. I'm going to check my brake drum, making sure it's not cracked or worn too thin. I'm going to check the inside of my rim to make sure there's no cracks or welds. Check the inside of my tire, make sure there's no cuts or blemishes. It's a radial tire. This tire cannot be recapped, removed, or retreaded. It has to have 4/32 of tread all the way across, minimum. I'm going to check the outside of this tire for any cuts or blemishes. I'm going to check my valve stem to make sure it's not touching my rim, and it has a metal cap. I've had an air pressure gauge, make sure it had the proper pressure. Check each lug nut to make sure none are loose, none are missing, none are cracked, and there's no rust around any of them. That would tell me one was has been loose. I'm going to check my axle seal to make sure it's not leaking any grease. I'm going to check each nut and bolt to make sure that it's not missing. They're all tight and secure. I'm going to check the oil level there on my axle seal. Before I leave this area, I'm looking for anything else that looks like it might be missing, broken, unusual. Okay. All right, as I come down, I'm going to check my door, make sure it opens properly. I'm going to check my hinge to make sure my hinge is securely mounted, make sure my door is secure, make sure I have a rubber seal inside my door. I'm going to check my frame of my mirror, make sure it's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins, make sure none of my glass is broken. I would open my battery box and check my battery to make sure that the cables were connected properly or securely, and there's no corrosion on my cables. I check my wet tanks to make sure they were secure, and I drain them each day by hand at the end of the working day, checking my air hoses for any cuts or tape. I'm looking under my vehicle for leaks, transmission leaks, any leaks of any kind. Checking my exhaust pipe to make sure I don't have any leaks there. If I saw soot marks, I'd know I'd have an exhaust leak. Make sure it's securely mounted. I'm going to check my muffler to make sure that it's mounted securely, the clamps are secure, it's not missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins, and there's no holes in my muffler. I'm going to check my drive shaft to make sure there's no debris lodged in my U-joints. My drive shaft is secure. Make sure that my drive shaft support clamp is secure in position. I'm checking my frame of my tractor as I go down through here to make sure there's no cracks or welds. I'm checking my U-bolt spring mount to make sure it's not missing nuts, bolts. The U-bolts are secure, that my leaf spring is secure to my axle. Checking my leaf springs to make sure none are missing or broken. Checking my spring hanger, spring mount, make sure it's not cracked or welded. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I'm going to check my brake chamber to make sure it's securely mounted. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Check my air brake hoses to make sure that there are no cutter tape on my air brake hoses and the clamps are secured to my brake chamber and I don't hear any leaks. I'm going to check my slack adjuster. Push rod shouldn't move any more than 3/4 to 1 inch when I move my slack adjuster. Slack adjuster is mounted at a 90-degree angle. It's not missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I want to check my brake shoes to make sure my brake shoes are not worn too thin, missing, or broken. I'm going to check my brake drum to make sure it's not cracked or worn too thin. Check the inside of my tire, inside of my rim for any cracks or welds. This tire, my inside tire, is a radial tire. I don't see any cuts or blemishes on it. This tire has to have 2/32 of tread. It can be recapped, regrooved, and retreaded. If I had a spacer, the spacer would be located in between my duals. I would make sure it's secure. Make sure my duals are not touching and there's nothing lodged between my duals. My outside tire has to have 2/32 of tread. It can be recapped, regrooved, or retreaded. Checking to make sure I have clearance between my tires and my trailer. I'm going to come back to this area in just a few minutes. Go back up to the top. I'm going to check my electrical connection at my tractor. Make sure it's in, it's seated. Check my electrical line to make sure there's no cut or tape. Make sure the electrical connection at the trailer is in and seated and locked in position. I'm going to check my emergency or supply line. Make sure there's no cut or tape. Make sure my glad hand is secure to the relay valve and I don't hear any leaks. Check my service signal control line. Make sure that there's no cut or tape on it. Make sure the glad hand is secure to the relay valve and I don't hear any leaks. If I had a catwalk, it'd be mounted right here. I would make sure it was securely mounted, not cracked, broken. And I'm going to check my space between my apron and my fifth wheel. Make sure there's no space. Check to make sure it's well greased for steering. I'm going to check my locking lever release arm. It's in the lock position, which is in and down. If I had a safety catch, it would be over. This is a permanent mount fifth wheel, so I'm going to check to make sure all the bolts are in place, not missing any nuts or bolts, and it's not cracked or broken. I'm going to check my platform to make sure it's not cracked or broken, welded. If I had a sliding fifth wheel, I would make sure it was in the lock position. Come back to the tire. Check the outside of my tire. This is a radial tire as well, making sure there's no cuts or blemishes on it. Check my inside tire valve stem, make sure it's not touching. If I had an air pressure gauge, I'd check the pressure to make sure it had the proper pressure. I'm checking to make sure it's got a metal cap. Check my outside tire valve stem, make sure it's not touching. If I had a pressure gauge, I'd check it to make sure that it had the proper pressure and it's got a metal cap. I check each lug nut to make sure none of them are loose, missing, or cracked. I look for rust around one. That'll tell me one has been loose. Check my axle seal to make sure it's not leaking any grease. Check each nut and bolt on my axle seal to make sure that none are missing. As I go under, if I had a splash guard or a mud flap, I check to make sure it was secure, not broken. Going under the vehicle, I would check my jaws to make sure they're around the shank of my kingpin. Check my kingpin to make sure it's not cracked or missing. I'm going to check my lenses to make sure that my lenses are intact. Check my airbags to make sure they're properly inflated. I'm going to check the shock absorber to make sure the shock absorber is not leaking any grease. It's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Checking the clearance between the back of my tractor to my trailer. I'm going to check my landing gear, make sure my landing gear is raised all the way up and I don't see any damage to the landing gear. Check my crank handle, make sure it's secure in the cradle. We'll come up and I'm going to check my header board, make sure it's secure. Checking my lenses to make sure none of them are broken. Make sure that my locking handle's in the lock position. I would check each door down the side, make sure they were all locked. Check my amber light up that lens. Check my DOT reflectors. I'm about to lose my voice. Amber light, DOT reflectors. Check for damage to my frame. This is not really the frame. The frame is really right here, but this truck doesn't have a frame like that, so you just call it down the side.
Okay.
Okay, I'm checking the outside of my trailer tire for any cuts or blemishes. It's a radial tire. This tire can be recapped, regrooved, or retreaded. Just have 2 seconds of tread. I'm going to check my inside tire valve stem to make sure it's not touching. Make sure it's got a metal cap. And if I had a tire pressure gauge, I'd make sure I had the proper pressure. Checking my outside tire valve stem, make sure it's not touching. If I had a gauge, I'd check to make sure it had proper pressure. It does have a metal cap. Check each lug nut to make sure none are missing, none are cracked, none are broken, none are loose. And if I saw any rust around them, they would tell me one of them has been loose. Check my axle seal to make sure it's not leaking any grease. Make sure my nuts and bolts are all tight and none missing. And check the fluid level of my oil to make sure. I'm checking between my duals If I had a spacer, I'd make sure the spacer was secure. I don't have a spacer. I'll make sure my duals are not touching. Make sure nothing's lodged in between my tires. I'm checking the inside of my outside tire for cuts or blemishes. I'm checking the outside of my inside tire for cuts or blemishes. Checking the inside of my inside tire for cuts or blemishes. This tire is a radial tire as well. I'm checking my spring hanger, spring mount. Make sure it's not missing any nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. It's not been cracked or welded. I will check my leaf springs. Make sure none are missing or broken. I'm going to check my U-bolt spring mounts to make sure they're not missing. Also that it's not missing any nuts or bolts, and that my leaf springs are properly mounted to the axle. I'm going to check my brake chamber to make sure my brake chamber is securely mounted. It's not loose. I don't hear any leaking. I'm going to check my slack adjuster, mounted at a 90-degree angle. Make sure it's not missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. I'm going to check the push rod to make sure it's not bent, broken, or missing. I'm going to check the air hoses to make sure there's no cutter tape on any of my air hoses. Make sure the air hoses are clamped securely to my brake chamber. I'm going to check my brake shoes to make sure none are missing, broken, or worn too thin. Check my brake drum to make sure it's not worn too thin or cracked. Check my rim to make sure the rim has no cracks or wells. I'm looking for anything else that looks unusual, missing, broken. I do not have shock absorbers, so. Okay, coming around the back of the vehicle, check my light lenses to make sure my lenses are all not broken and missing. If I had a back door, I'd check to make sure that my back door was closed and secure. Checking my lights, lenses, and top, make sure none of those are broken. Check to make sure I have a current tag on my trailer. Same thing on this side as I did the other side, with a couple of exceptions. Check to make sure that my fuel tank is secure. Fuel tank is secure. Make sure I have my rubber strap between my metal strap and the metal tank. I'm going to open my fuel cap. I'm going to visually check my fuel. Sometimes fuel gauges don't work. Okay, and we'll check to make sure I have a rubber seal in my fuel cap, and I'm going to put it back on and tighten it. Okay, I'm checking my fuel line to make sure it's not leaking any fuel. Checking my electrical connections to my fuel pump to make sure there's no cut or tape and it's connected securely. Okay? Next we'll close the hood. And I'm going to check to make sure I have a fully charged fire extinguisher and it's securely mounted. I'm going to check to make sure I have 3 reflective triangles and make sure that I have spare fuses. I'm going to put my seat belt on and I'm going to fasten it tightly or snugly where it's a good fit. Make sure my seat belt's not worn, frayed, or cut. Mr. Tester, I'm going to ask you to do the same, and she's going to tell you she'll do it later. You've already told her. Next thing I'm going to do is look down both my sides of the truck, out my mirrors to make sure I can see clearly down both sides of it. All right, next I'm going to do is turn my switch on position. You'll see what my air pressure is. Okay, it's at about 115. I'm going to drop it down to 85. Now I'm going to start my engine. When it gets to 85 PSI, I'm going to time it. Shouldn't take any more than 45 seconds to go from 85 to 100. And this is checking my air compressor. It's at 85 now. Shouldn't take any more than 45 seconds. Okay, it's there. I'm going to let it build on up to 120 while I'm waiting for it to build up to 120. I'm going to check my windshield to make sure I don't have any cracks, 2 inches long with 2 intersecting cracks. Make sure I don't have any stickers in my windshield that obstruct my vision. I'm going to check my windshield wiper motor to make sure it's working. Check my wiper fluid to make sure it's working. Washer fluid. I'm going to check my left turn signal indicator, my right turn signal indicator, my emergency flashers, make sure they're all working. Turn my lights on, check my high beam indicator to make sure it's working. I'm going to check my driver's side window to make sure it rolls up and down. Check my steering wheel to make sure I have no more than 10 degrees at 2 inches of play. I'm going to check my city horn and my air horn, both of them, okay? Now that my engine's had a chance to warm up, I'm going to check my oil pressure to make sure it's in normal operating range, between 40 and 60. Make sure that I'm going to check the temperature, water temperature gauge to make sure that it's not overheating, my vehicle's not overheating. Check my fuel gauge, since I've got a little more than 3/4 of the tank. Make sure that'll be enough to get me through the day. Checking my voltmeter to make sure that my alternator is charging my battery. And of course I'm checking my air gauges. If I had a shifter, I'd make sure the shifter wasn't broken. If I had a clutch, I'd make sure I had a strong clutch spring. I'm going to check my heater. Check my defroster to make sure both of those are working. Okay, now I'm up at the 120 PSI. I'm going to apply my trailer brake, release my parking brake, pull forward, and my trailer brakes will hold. There they go. Release my trailer brakes, apply my parking brake, pull forward till my parking brakes hold. Now this is when I would pull forward at 5 miles an hour and hit my brakes and check my service brakes. If everybody's hanging on, I won't do that. You just pull forward at 5 miles an hour, hit your brakes to make sure the vehicle doesn't pull to the left or the right, that your service brakes are working. Okay? Alright. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut the engine off, reset the gauges, now with my brakes released, my foot on the floor, I shouldn't lose any more than 3 PSI in 1 minute. Say a minute's up. Then I'm going to put my foot on the treadle valve or the brake pedal or the foot valve and hold it for 1 minute, and after the initial drop in pressure, I shouldn't lose any more than 4 PSI. Okay, let's say a minute's up. Next, I'm going to check my air warning buzzer, which comes on before it falls below 60 PSI. And there we are. Next, I'm going to check my tractor protection valve. It'll pop out somewhere between 20 and 40. Okay, both, make sure your parking brake and your trailer brake both pop out. Now I'm going to restart my engine. Let my air pressure build back up to 120. And on your test, this is when you come to a stop. In your mind, go through, did I miss anything? Did I get the windshield? Did I get the sticker? Did I roll my window down? Did I check my mirrors? She's sitting over there now. She's fixing to tell you what you're going to do next. You're waiting for that air pressure to build up because you can't go anywhere. Once you tell her that I'm done in here, you can't go back and say, oh, I forgot to check my heater and my defroster. Then she'll exit the cab. She'll tell you what she needs you to do, which will be go down back in a straight line. Then when the air pressure gets up to 120, pull up. Just release your brakes, pull up, go get your wheel chalk, throw it back in here, and then release your brakes and drive down there where she wants you to go. Now that's pre-trip.